Welcome to Arctic Frontiers 2025. Arctic Frontiers Beyond Borders is this theme of this year's Arctic Frontiers conference. We're here in our little studio on the top floor, I would say, of The Edge, the hotel where Arctic Frontiers happens every day. And we're here for Arctic Frontiers Offstage. What's Arctic Frontiers Offstage? It's our idea to summarize what has happened during the big picture session, summarize a bit the main themes, the main discussion points, and give you an idea of what has happened during Arctic Frontiers in case you didn't have the chance to be here with us in Tromsø, or in case you want to get an idea of what you have heard in case you missed it during the big picture. Today is Tuesday, the 28th of January.
Yeah.
I think I'm right.
I believe so.
And we've just listened and heard the first big picture on our Arctic state of affairs. And now we're here to summarize. With me here, forgot to introduce myself. My name is Andreas Raspotnik, and I'm the host of this year's Arctic Frontiers conference. And with me here, we have the head of division for Arctic policy from the German Foreign Office, Franziska Hagenoin. Thank you very much for joining us from Berlin.
Pleasure to be here.
Pleasure. To my right, to your left, I would say, we have Andrew Erskine, who is a research fellow at the Institute of Peace and Diplomacy in Ottawa, Canada, and also an Arctic Frontiers emerging leader. Andrew, thank you for making it.
Thank you for making time.
And to my left, to your right, we have Gosia Śmieszek, who is a research fellow at the University of the Arctic here in Tromsø, UIT, in order to be, to say it correctly. So as I said, the idea is really to summarize of what had happened based on the big discussion themes. And of course, the idea was, let's discuss what's happening in the Arctic from a more broader politics point of view, the state of affairs in the Arctic. Franziska, I want to start with you. What are today's Arctic state of affairs? What is happening in the Arctic from an educated Berlin guess?
Well, I think today's discussion showed in the big picture session, but also before, that geopolitical shift that has occurred with the Russian aggression since 2014 and the full-scale invasion. We've seen that has really changed the security order in Europe and beyond, and also in the Arctic. And the question is now somehow for everyone, how do we engage in this Arctic, in this context? That is sort of the framework that the discussions were moving in. I thought that was really interesting. And then not to forget, although our discussions center a lot about the security framework, is that the other challenges remain. Climate change is accelerating with all the effects we can expect on, life in the Arctic, options for sea passages, questions of resource extraction. So all of that picture still remains and needs to be discussed. And the challenges we've heard about today is we've seen an attack on international law, the fundamental principles of international law. What does this mean for us? How should we react? How should we make sure that remains a basic tenet of how we act? The remilitarization of the Arctic by Russia. At the same time, Russia is retreating from institutions that they see as Western dominated. What does this mean for us as actors in the Arctic? And again, as I mentioned, sort of those effects of climate change on everyone. I think this is sort of the state of affairs that we're all grappling with.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to ask the same question to Andrew. I mean, today's Arctic affairs, we are aware of the changes that happened 2 years ago, or now almost 3 years ago. International politics also had an impact on the Arctic. We're aware of what's happening at the moment when it comes to Arctic geopolitics. From your perspective as a Canadian, and you've also been part of the Arctic Frontiers emerging leadership program. What do you think about today's Arctic state of affairs? How would you summarize it from your position as a Canadian?
Yeah, I would agree with what was just previously said. I would also just extend it as well that the state of affairs in the Arctic is a period in which the exceptionalism that has defined the Arctic since the Cold War ended, where you had the Arctic nations come together and cooperate with each other on important issues, as well as not getting divergent to geopolitical interests and priorities that shape the rest of the global environment past the post-Cold War era. We're seeing that completely being eroded. Obviously Russia's military strikes within Ukraine and the war efforts there, but we're also seeing an increased internationalization of the area as well. We're seeing China wanting to become a polar great power. We're also seeing countries within the EU looking north and seeing possibilities of collaborating with partners, but also looking at where their interests, their international interests lie, especially when it comes to climate, whether it's economic development, resource extraction and development. But then we also see, in Asia, the Arctic is also becoming much more of an interested transportation route to connect the East and West. We see South Korea in their global partnership strategy, wanting to become a global actor in the international space order. We see that they've released an Arctic strategy and want to perceive and understand where their interests and where their collaboration can maybe lie. I would say from an emerging leader standpoint, the Arctic is an area in which although there is a lot of different perspectives and opinions, there is a lot more that connects us than say, prohibits us from having discourses or dialogues. And I would say that it transcends all languages, it transcends all cultures and all historical precedents. And that is really, the human-to-human relationship of us in the Arctic. What does that mean for us individually? What does it mean for us as a collective? And what does it mean as us within a nation state? And it's interesting in the discussion that, all of those were indicated: climate, security, resilience, economic opportunity, but also expectation to ensure that the environment is respected with our notions, but also with the notions of Indigenous peoples as well, ensuring that they're included in the dialogues as well. So I think we're in an interesting period where the Arctic state of affairs is one of changing, but also one in which we understand where our values and our interests lie, and they're among us in the West. There is a lot more of collection and one of cohesion that I think should be a driving force for us in the future.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really want to come back to what you asked about. What is it that connects us in the Arctic? Because that was also raised in the big picture we just heard. Connecting the Arctic, working together. What does that mean in this new era? Maybe. Yeah. Gosh, also the same question to you. Both of us have been, dealing with Arctic geopolitics, and that was one of the interests why we got interested, I guess, in the Arctic in the beginning. 15
that was a long time ago.
Yeah, we are like senior youth, I would say. Like 15 years ago. But obviously, geopolitics is a driving force of Arctic interest. That's why people are interested in the Arctic, outside the Arctic. There's nothing we shouldn't be shy saying that. But from your perspective, working a lot on this policy science interface, Arctic Council matters, how do you see the state of affairs in the Arctic today, keeping in mind that, yes, geopolitics is something that concerns us, and the Arctic has been dragged into broader global political debates?
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much for this question. I mean, of course, I definitely agree with everything that's been raised here so far. But you raised the word exceptional, and I think that was something that was also I picked from I think it was Sarah Olsvik, the chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, and she used the term exceptional, but by saying that Arctic actually is still exceptional space. That even though we see erosion of so many things that I think we almost took for granted for the last 10, 15 years or so, but they actually, certain values, the dialogue, engagement with Arctic indigenous peoples, the truth is that at the global stage, these are still exceptional things, that it's kind of, that the fact that we continue having these discussions, that not everything completely collapsed, I think still makes Arctic exceptional. And of course, we can go into details, and maybe I'm the one just trying to find hopeful moments there. But I thought that was really important message that was coming from Sarah. And another point that she raised, and I think it goes more directly to your point about the Arctic Council, Sarah was using the expression of Arctic 14. Which I think is not the one we use frequently, but maybe that's the one we should actually embrace more for our conversation moving forward, because that also speaks so much about the state of Arctic affairs and the Arctic Council. The fact that this body, the forum, survived. Thanks to huge, tireless work of Norwegian chairship for the last 2 years, that the fact that that the council is not only that the council is still there, but it's kind of that its engine is restarted, that we start seeing first results of work of the working groups again, and maybe we can come back to it. I mean, even here, this very conference yesterday started with the release of key findings from the latest AMAP climate update. I think this speaks volumes to the fact that this work is still going on at much lower level, way less visible than maybe it used to be before, but absolutely critical. So it's kind of not to forget this part, that even though now it's away from limelight for probably some good reasons, this effort is still there, and that's kind of something we can continue with. Of course, to bring this to this discussion, I mean, it's even until a month ago, we felt that, well, we have Arctic 7 and one other country, and I think now we are all grappling situation with maybe a quite different U.S. Foreign policy. I think the implications of it's yet hard to see in detail how this will unfold. But it's once again, it's kind of to this turmoil or so. There are things that are going on, important work that continues, alliances, the collaboration, and so. But at the same time, it seems the challenges are mounting.
Yeah, please. That's
Because
what we're here for.
What you said, it also resonated with me a lot, that she used the word exceptional. And there's been an academic debate whether the exceptionalism ever really existed. We don't need to go into that now in an academic term, but I think it's been certainly a narrative that we all told ourselves and that became a reality. And she also mentioned that it's up to the actors in the Arctic to treat it, to continue treating it exceptional. So it's up to us to keep it exceptional, and that's not not one actor, Russia or whoever might diverge. It's up to those who act in the Arctic to treat it according to those principles. And during this day, a lot was mentioned about trust as the Nordic gold. We're a non-Arctic nation, but we understand the clue, and we're hoping to contribute to that. The solidarity, cooperation, that is up to us to continue, and that really resonated with me. Yeah.
Yeah, I like very much where you go, because I think you're both continuing the road of being an optimistic realist, what was also mentioned by one of the participants. So if I understood you correctly, it's not the end of the Arctic's history, if we want to paraphrase Fukuyama. But the question is then really like, okay, if the Arctic as a place, as a region also of cooperation is still some kind of exceptional, and we understand it here to some extent also, going beyond the borders to the east maybe, or now into the west. But how do we sell that outside the Arctic, How do you sell that new kind of reality while still taking the distrust issue, into account in Berlin? Maybe also south in Ottawa, or maybe even for us researchers outside the Arctic research world, how do we continue to, to be that optimistic realist, when it comes to the Arctic, as a future? Maybe, Andrew, you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was brilliantly said on the panel where, it's our values. It's how we can continue those optimistic but realistic messages of what the Arctic is and what the Arctic shall continue to be. Whether it's maintaining a high degree of partnership and trust among like-minded partners or allies in our case, whether it's a high status to ensure that the climate and the marine ecosystem and any other relatable issues is maintained and ensured that the integrity isn't denigrated by increased economic development or economic interest. So how can you signal those messages to a much more wider international audience will be imperative, especially when you have, I don't want to say adversaries, but when you have potentially belligerent forces that maybe want to revise or want to reshape the certain geopolitics in their area to, one, match their own international interests, match their own national interests, whether it's, like in China's case, to gain much more of a self-sufficiency in terms of critical minerals and resources to ensure that they can maintain their rise within the international system, or whether it's in the case of the United States, especially with President Trump's remarks with Greenland, to ensure that they maintain hegemony within the Western Hemisphere, which includes the North. So there's a lot of those kind of dialogues that I think we as Arctic nations and for the peoples that live in the Arctic have to find a way in which we can spread those messages and ensure that those values are transcended. I think one way that could be done, and it wasn't hinted on that much, was through subnational diplomacy, right? we tend to typically see, Arctic dialogues, Arctic diplomacy as, well, it's state-centric. And then we're starting to see, well, maybe we should bring in indigenous stakeholders, indigenous communities, indigenous organizations. I think what should be really taken is, well, instead of just including the indigenous peoples, let's start including the jurisdictions in which they live in. So in Canada, we have, the 3 territorial provinces, Nunavut, Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. So why not do we bring those in and let them form their own dialogues with, say, Alaska, the different counties here in Norway, and the different counties in the Scandinavian countries. That way, they would have much more ability to, one, project their messages, increase their dialogues to see if there is any commonality or any challenges in that perspective of how we can increase our spreading that message of our values in the region, and therefore inform the state governments, which was brilliantly pointed out, majority of the time are in the south. They're not in the Arctic region. So there is that north-south divide. And also for, countries as well that may not inhabit Arctic areas, those subnational diplomacy discussions can bring much more in-line discussions and thought to ensure that, the common vision that, what you believe is strong and exceptional of the region is maintained, and it continues to flow despite the geopolitical rise in interest in the region for, whether it's bilateral, multilateral, unilateral interest to advance their own claims and priorities.
It'd be interesting if that will be brought up, in the next session, of today, where we try to look at strengthening regional capacity, if that intra-Arctic regional cooperation angle could be some. But Franziska, keeping in mind what Andrew just said about subnational dialogue, but also like what I initially asked, about what could we actually do to better, not sell, but better explain the Arctic exceptionalism, whatever you call it, like outside the Arctic. And like for you from a Berlin perspective, where I guess Arctic politics maybe easily, become part of a foreign policy issue or something else, like how do you do that on a practical level? And like what could be the role of a non-Arctic actor in that regard?
Yeah. Exactly. As a non-Arctic actor, I think we have a very different discussion, both in the policy space and with society. And there are at least these 2 levels that sort of we think about. One is on the policy level. A bit more than a year ago, we came out with our first national security strategy as reflecting, the new security environment and what we need. And it has a sort of trias of robustness, resilience, and sustainability as the guiding principles. And now we tried to translate those for our own Arctic guidelines for the government, which came out last September, and to sort of explain what this really means in policy terms, because the national security strategy is logical for everyone. So we said, look, resilience means resilience of the rules-based international order. That means we need to support UNCLOS. That is a very real thing. That is a comprehensive legal framework. It relates to freedom of navigation. It touches upon interests, but it is also about the rules-based international order. It is about respecting the Polar Code, very practically. It is about the BBNJ, the Global Biodiversity Convention. This is, again, that's part of the resilience bit. It's also a little bit about sustainability. Everything that sort of happens in the Arctic Council relates to that. We take our cue from the Arctic nations. Obviously, we are only observers. But again, this is about resilience of the international system. And the research we try to provide there is about that, is about supporting that angle. Resilience means we give a lot of money to the Alfred Wegener Institute, for example, one of the prime research institutions, because we think they contribute on climate change, on environmental protection. But they also try and integrate the indigenous perspective in how they design their research. So that is, that is that policy level. And then we have the whole robustness debate, which relates to security and how do we make sure that we support and work with our Arctic neighbors. We work quite closely with Norway, for example, with a joint submarine production, things like that. But then there's sort of the societal angle, where I think in Germany you could say traditionally we have quite an idealistic view of the Arctic as this fascinating space that, not even empty. I think people have read novels and stories about the Arctic and the people who live there, but of course it's a little outdated. But that, I think we shouldn't disregard that. That can be turned around, and because there's a keen interest, that's why we're able to put quite significant amounts of money into research, but to explain what people living in the Arctic, what indigenous groups now need and how we can support that from where we are, and how we've, for many decades done research, and how we now gently shift it. But to create that societal support, we've got a good basis, and now need to communicate about that. But that's sort of where Germany is right now.
Gotcha. Like following up on this, like societal support, and I think if I remember today, you attended a session organized by Arctic Passion, where I think you tackled also the subnational level and how maybe research could strengthen subnational cooperation, if I understood it correctly. But like following up on that, like societal support, supporting societies, subnational cooperation, region to region. What's the research perspective on that? Like, do we have the means, the capacity, also like the human capacity, the financial capacity to actually do that? Or is there more work that needs to be done in that regard?
Well, I think the answer is both, because I think it is one of the things that I find very important to stress here is also to recognize, I think, the fair amount of progress that has been made in Arctic issues or in funding provided for Arctic research, but also how differently we think today about making science, about conducting scientific research in the Arctic. The truth is, it's been evolution, it's been a long journey, both for Arctic states and non-Arctic states, with long tradition of conducting science in the Arctic. So I think it is important to sometimes that also relates to your previous question, because sometimes I think it is easy to use black and white terms to describe things, that we don't engage with indigenous peoples, or there is no co-production of knowledge or so. And it's not a pendulum in a full swing. I would say we've made progress, maybe not strides, probably we're not moving as fast as we all wished, and yet it is moving. And I think all of us in this space, that's my genuine feeling. There is everyone's commitment. That was actually one of the phrases that was used so in the big picture session, we've been showing the video of Arctic youth. And I think if I captured it correctly, one of the young persons in this video said that Arctic necessitates long-term commitments, not short-term decisions. And I think that's exactly what I feel continuously in the Arctic space, that with so many people, not everyone, there are some parachuters, so to say, who discover the Arctic, they get all the excitement and so on. They stay, and I dare to say, they stay with us for 2-3 years at best, and they move to other region. But then there are so many people who stay in Arctic and are passionate about the Arctic for long haul. And I think that's another. Now I'm maybe just coming only optimistic, but I think realistic. I think I'm still in realism part there. That being said, there is still definitely work to be done. So the session that you mentioned, that was put by the Arctic Passion Project, which is one of the largest EU-funded research projects in the Arctic. And discussion was specifically about, is the research that we are doing that is very well funded by the EU, does it help to address needs of local decision makers? And we had very different perspectives there addressing these questions. And it feels fair to say that, yes, we are continuously trying to build this dialogue, longer-term collaboration with municipalities, with local decision makers, and yet sometimes we miss it. It doesn't work exactly as we wished. But I think, once again, this fact that we are in a continuous dialogue, that there are people who are always showing up for this discussion, thinking how we can do this better next time, for next project, for next financial cycle, and so forth. I think, there is work to be done, but there is also definitely a lot of effort being put into making this progress.
You described a really interesting dilemma, and maybe you want to follow up on that if you think it's interesting as well. I mean, on the one hand, you correctly state, we come back to the Arctic, we learn from maybe mistakes made, how can we do research better, how can we do a better dialogue, how can we be more inclusive, And then on the other hand, we always have some kind of newcomers, or maybe the media attention is rising because of some international developments. But then what's our role in here? Because then are we probably not correctly selling the progress made in the Arctic? Or is then always, what I've heard also in today's session, is geopolitics then always the one level that trumps, in a way, research efforts or collaboration in whatever kind of way, like how do we get over that, if we assume that, it works well, we continue, with what we learn from each other, dialogue is getting better and better, but then there's always, this push from the outside, inside, and okay.
Oh, I would say also discussed today was a lot of the time when it comes to the Arctic, there's a shock. And most of the time that shock is either external or it's internal. And that kind of brings the Arctic to the forefront of discussion, whether it's for, why is the Arctic important for science and research? Why is it important for security and militarization policies and strategies? Speaking from a Canadian standpoint, this has always been a continuum in our history, in our country's political history. During the Cold War, it was a way to distinguish ourselves from the Americans, but also increase our collaboration. So NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, over the Arctic, we would come to an agreement in which the Canadian government would install surveillance technologies, radar, sensors to ensure that we could detect any missiles or any kind of military force coming over from the Arctic. And then as the Cold War dissipated, well, that kind of distinction kind of went away. And then with different administrations, specifically Stephen Harper's Conservatives, the Arctic came back. It was a way, again, to distinguish ourselves and say, well, we have complete sovereignty over the Northwest Passage, which is a passage mostly traversing the Northwest Nunavut, and it's a key economic transportation route. The Americans indicated that they wanted this to become an internationalized body of water. Well, that was a shock to the Canadian Canadian politicians. And so for us, the Arctic is, we have sovereignty in that area. We have autonomy. We're willing to work with you, but it's us. It's ours first and foremost. And even within that setting, the indigenous population would then have the reaction of going, well, no, it's also, we have a claim to that area. We have historical and heritage and cultural rights in that area. But now all of a sudden you're kind of going to sidestep us because now it's a national security interest. So even at a local level, how can you correspond that to ensure that those shocks take into account all perspectives? And then with the Trudeau government, when it came in 2015, the Arctic wasn't seen as much as a security issue. It was more turned around towards reconciliation. How can we work with Indigenous peoples to create more opportunity, more equality amongst developments in terms of infrastructure, connectivity, healthcare, housing, and then with a more populist, demographic in the United States with the first term of President Donald Trump, and then a more protectionist Joe Biden, and then obviously with a second Trump administration, our most recent defense policy is now mostly centered on the Arctic. It's called Our North Strong and Free. It hits you dead smack in the middle that the Arctic is now coming back into the forefront of national security discussions. So I think these shocks have really exacerbated this, back and forth of, well, is the Arctic important? Is it the way that we can increase collaboration, or is it a way to hinder that collaboration? And I would say other countries have contributed to that shock through an external perspective, whether it's China, and this was Canada discovered this firsthand, the sea boys in the Arctic. We detected that they came from China, and then when we saw that, they were collecting data, we weren't too sure. Was it just, is it marine for mapping the subsurface level? Is it for surface data? Is it military perspectives? So again, that's another shock. And then in the technology sense, it's okay. Well, now we're clearly behind on that sense. So now, how can we collaborate with our partners to lower that capability gap that we no longer have to counter those actions? So I think the shock and awe, I guess, of the Arctic and the state of how geopolitics shape it is something that is continual, and I wouldn't be surprised if something else happens in the Arctic. It will again shock us into a realization that it needs either more collaboration or more resources towards the science field, state to state, or subnational issues.
But then, Franziska, how do you create some kind of Arctic legacy in a non-Arctic state? Some kind of, an Arctic legacy of interest. It goes beyond these shocks, something, where you try to sell, in your case, to a German audience, the Arctic as something that's not only about shocks and geopolitics, but some, let's say, maybe more important, or different agendas, How do you do that from a practical political point of view?
interesting question, since I'm probably one of the parachuters in a way, because the way our system works, right? No. I'm just, I was just reflecting on this, because our system, I take up an assignment for 4 years roughly, and then I will probably have to move on, but hopefully bring in some experience from elsewhere. But this question is, how do you keep attention? I mean, in a way, as you say, some things are forced upon the Arctic, and I sit in a section of the ministry together with a lot of security relevant other divisions, so that is a focus. But as I said, we very quickly saw that we need to keep also the focus on those other issues that are important to us, as I said, effects of climate change, sustainability, environment, and so forth. And I think someone said that in the panel earlier. The attention the Arctic is now receiving might be a challenge, but it is also an opportunity. I think it was the Norwegian foreign minister who said that. And to me, that relates in our huge Arctic research and environment and engagement, maybe to two things. We have a research community that is relatively stable over the years. They contribute then also to the definition of research emphases internationally. There are international fora who do these kind of things where our scientists contribute. So that is relatively stable, and financing goes over several years. And also, if you build infrastructure, that helps. Yeah. And for example, there's always a question of what made the decisive difference. But in December, recently decided to build a Polarstern 2, which really will make a big difference. That is the big ship that enables these collaborative international research missions, like, remember the Polarstern froze itself in the Arctic and then drifted through towards Canada. There were, I think, 20 nations on board. That is what we want to continue, but you need the infrastructure. And now we were able to push this across the finish line, and Parliament okayed the process to go forward for this to be commissioned. So building infrastructure does help, but it is also the awareness raising publicly with all the advocates from NGOs, organizations, researchers going out there and explaining to people why this is relevant. And that's also the great fun of it, of course.
Thank you very much. I think we're all very optimistic here. I mean, for the last question here, I want to maybe use your infrastructure thought and think about multilateralism as some kind of Arctic infrastructure. We heard about the predictability of multilateralism, to tackle the complexity of interests. You mentioned, Franziska, the resilience of the international system, legal system, global order. Gosha, from your point of view, as a researcher dealing a lot with the policy science interface, the Arctic Council as the epitome of kind of Arctic multilateralism in some way, when you heard about the predictability of multilateralism as something to go forward, what was your thought, maybe like in today's area, where multilateralism is under challenge from various sides, internal and external, as you said,
It's, I think it's once again this kind of question that I'm not sure there is yes or no an answer to it. I think it's in case of the Arctic Council, I think we see that it works. We simply see that it works, that it can survive even through such incredibly challenging circumstances. We are able to sustain the institutions that we've built over time, and it's an Arctic Council for so many years, and we've seen this discussion for I don't know how long, has been criticized that it's for its weakness, for not having treaty foundation, for not being legally binding. And who cares about these decisions if they are not legally binding? And yet, at the end of the day, this is the forum that we have that survived, that all 8 Arctic states continuously support to and work with. So I think on this level, I actually maybe do feel a little bit more optimistic that when it comes to certain developments globally, because I think, well, there is the challenge of, for instance, we all know the climate change issue is not something that we can resolve effectively among 8 Arctic states or even Well, actually, if we were resolving it with the observers to the Arctic Council, we would be already covering fair share of world emissions. That's there is a point there to be made, but there is obviously some fracturing. I mean, we don't really discuss here Antarctic issues and so on, but we know that some elements that were part of polar governance, global governance, the multilateral system, that they are also going through serious tensions. So I think it's kind of, so I was also reflecting on your previous question, it's what is our role? And I think it's all just staying engaged in this dialogue. To go back to one of the things that Espen Barafeide said, he said, well, he pointed out the extreme polarization, which characterizes today huge parts of the world, not only the United States, but it's present in so many in our countries in different formats as well. And yet he pointed out that what we need, that it's on us to work with it, to try to have a dialogue. And it's and for me, it's I do have a feeling I'm coming here, Chris, as very optimistic, but it's also. But I think this is partly our role. If I can add two more points here, because your question was also what we can do, and I thought I was reflecting on first when Senator Murkowski spoke, and I think part of this is also bringing nuance to this discussion, because I think, well, it was only one side of things that we've seen mostly coming from the United States and the new administration there, but then hearing the views of such experienced lawmaker from the U.S. Senate and her views on this, and understanding that not all the views that were shared widely across global media recently are fully supported, that there is much more to that, and that maybe there is a chance for all of us to pursue this path. And the last thing to say here, because I need to say I found this first session, the State of Affairs, I thought it was really terrific. But I was also really struck when, once again, Norway's Minister of Foreign Affairs, when he recalled the situation from 2005, 2007, and when it was, first of all, I think it speaks volume about having politicians who are for so long with these issues. It's kind of how many changes they've seen. But I was also struck when he said that what they thought, and he was speaking of himself and today's prime minister, what they thought would be Arctic future never came to be. That it was their view of how future will unfold is today in a very, very different place. But I thought that was also, again, it can be a gloomy picture, but it's also opening. That is kind of, if today's we are looking at the darker times or so many tensions, yet there might be a future that that we just don't see from the place we are today.
On a general note, I think it's always better to be optimistic than negative, and we all have different roles to play. So my role here is a bit to be black and white, but I appreciate, of course, all the nuances you bring to the debate. But of course, I also want to give Andrew and Franziska a last word on maybe this predictability of multilateralism. What also Gosha alluded to, that you need maybe individuals, that can drive something forward, and even if to, put the complexity into perspective. But also push something forward. So from your perspective, the predictability about multilateralism, where are we today? What is the state of affairs from this multilateral cooperational point of view?
I fully agree with what was just said in terms of, we go through, again, not to bring in these shock and awe, but we go through turbulent times, but we still see that there are institutions, like the Arctic Council, where there was a lot of, what's going to happen after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And you're right, it survived. These institutions are built, and there's so much mechanisms in this place, and the states that inhabit them or participate in them realize that you can't, just simply throw this out because you perceive that it's no longer going to be functionable, either because one member is kicked out or because there's, gloomy scenarios in the environment. These are institutions that are incredibly resilient, and rightfully so, because the mission in which they serve reflect how important that institution is to ensure that governance is still maintained and continues. I would say from ensuring that multilateralism continues in that fashion. Yes, leaders, individuals need to partake and need to have strong voices and strong platforms. But what we're seeing in the West, and Canada's going through this issue as well, is politicians and these individuals need to be able to communicate to the community, to the population, that this is important for us, not just from a national security sense, not from an economic or climate or resource development step. It's just better for our national presence and our national existence that we have to partake in this institution because one, it's a responsibility. Two, it does advance certain interests. And three, there is an expectation, I would say, as well, from other partners and allies that inhabit, the Arctic Council or other multilateral frameworks, that we are going to be effective, efficient, and long-term partners in this. We're not going to simply step aside because we disagree politically on an issue, which, unfortunately, down south, down south, it seems like that seems like it's more prevalent. So I think definitely getting the public and the community engaged, involved, and understanding. I mean, before we had this conversation, you indicated that when you developed the German Arctic foreign policy, that you collaborated quite distinctly with the Department of Education. And why was that key? Well, it's key in the sense that if you want to get the votes and you want to get the funding and the resources to support and ensure that the policy is continuously used in a long-term strategy, well, the public needs to be on side for that. And the huge thing is public awareness. So where do the public stand in understanding what Arctic governance or Arctic affairs means? And more importantly, how can they see the state of Arctic affairs impacting their own livelihoods, whether it's through a security dimension, whether it's through a reconciliation of Indigenous peoples or economic development opportunities. So all these things have to coincide with the community. And then from there, I think the long-term longevity and effectiveness of these multilateral institutions have more of a potential to be long-lasting and functionable.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And then now, maybe last words for Francisca, moving maybe away from this Canadian perspective and on how to include communities, Arctic communities, to also, tell them that we need to be there. We need to be active. From a German perspective, how do you raise Arctic awareness then, beyond the guidelines?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I hope we communicate about the guidelines. But I just wanted to say, I completely subscribe to what both of you just said, so I don't need to repeat that. I just want to say earlier in the discussion today, there was a lot about sort of dark times, but I think it's the context. But our optimism is more about that we can actually do something. We have sort of actorness here. Mm-hmm. I mean, yes, I do work for government, but we're a non-Arctic state, so we have a limited role. But that how we this predictability of international action, let's say, to point to joint values of clarity, that feeds back to our audience, let's say, to the German population. They do notice that. They say, this is also relevant in the Arctic, so we need to do this there as well. So, and even if it may sound naive, this standing up for what we believe to be right in terms of acting in the international system and then doing it is important in this context. And then to answer your question more concretely, how do you reach out? I mean, it is. For example, since we're strong on research, it is about making sure we communicate what our researchers are doing up there. We have a joint research station with the French up on Svalbard. How does this work actually? There's little documentaries around this. What is the reality of working as a researcher in the Arctic? How do you interact with an indigenous community when you start designing a project? How does what comes up there? These are things that people are actually still interested in. In the old days, you'd have these projections, of now this is a little different, but in fact people are still interested in that. There will just different sources for this, but to cater to this interest and show what our little contributions in this is, and I think makes a real difference. And keep explaining, although it's complex, as you said, nuance is an important word.
Thank you very much. I think that's something we always come back, be nuanced, not black and white, even if some people love to be black and white and need that for whatever purposes. What we did here now was try to summarize the very first session of the big picture on the state of Arctic affairs at Arctic Frontiers 2025. if you want to learn about more the complexity, you need to come here to Tromsø and actually participate in a conference. Thank you very much to Gosha, Franziska, and Andrew for being here with me and trying to put that complexity into some kind of perspective. And more from me and Arctic Frontiers later on, but thank you very much.